Boris Johnson has imploded in quite the most spectacular and frankly embarrassing way possible, as he was summoned before MPs to try and defend himself from accusations that he willfully or recklessly misled the House of Commons. That's because the former Prime Minister took the piss, partied throughout the lockdown that he imposed. So we had this lockdown where we were barred from doing very basic things, hugging people, partying, couldn't go to funerals, couldn't hold the hands of our dying relatives. But Boris Johnson, on the other hand, number 10, the hacienda upon the Thames, as it became, party central during that lockdown. We're just going to talk about Boris Johnson, and I'm going to have just look at what he said, because it really is so risible. But I also, in typical style, I would hope, without writing my own reviews, like to draw some wider lessons, not just about Boris Johnson, but about the establishment. Now, let's just hear how he opened, shall we?
I'm here to say to you, hand on heart, that I did not lie to the House. When those statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. When this inquiry was set up, I was completely confident that you would find nothing to show I knew or believed anything else, as indeed you have not. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give for this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Now, the question here isn't whether he misled the House. He did mislead the House. And in fact, he has said he's misled the House.
I apologise. I apologise for inadvertently misleading this House. But to say that I did it recklessly or deliberately is completely untrue.
That's the question. Did he recklessly mislead the House, or did he deliberately do so? Now, let's just hear what he said. He said that he doesn't accept that people were not making an effort to distance themselves socially from each other. Let's just hear him say that.
I don't accept that people were not making an effort to distance themselves socially from each other, and that happened the whole time in number 10.
Okay, let's just go on the basis of one photo. Now, this one picture has Boris Johnson raising a glass at a party. The reason I'm calling it a party is it's because it's in fact a party. There's no other word in the English language which more accurately describes a crowd of people in a room with a table covered in wine bottles and what appears to be an unopened bottle of champagne just right at the bottom, and some spirit or other, I think, a slightly smaller bottle. There was no social distancing of any meaningful description in this picture of this party, which Boris Johnson attended. That's the Boris Johnson who went to parties during lockdown. Now, Boris Johnson is asked if he denies saying one event he attended in Downing Street was probably the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK.
Another witness said that you joked during the gathering that it was, and I quote, probably the most unsocially distanced gathering in the UK right now, unquote. At paragraph 63 of your evidence, your written submission, you do say that you don't remember saying that, those particular words, but are you therefore denying that you said this?
I don't remember saying those words, and I think it unlikely that I would have said those words given what I've had to say to the committee just now about my memory of the event.
So he says, I don't remember saying those words. It's unlikely he would have said those words. Not the most cast iron denial, is it? I mean, it's just funny that someone suggested he said that, and it sounds exactly like the sort of thing Boris Johnson would say, and he hasn't gone, I absolutely did not say that. Because obviously if he admitted to saying that that's a smoking gun, he clearly deliberately misled the House, which I'm absolutely convinced he did, because his argument otherwise is that he is one of the most stupid people to ever have lived, which is essentially the cornerstone of his entire defence. Now, he's asked why it was necessary for him to attend leaving drinks by the Conservative MP Bernard Jenkin.
There were lots of people leading critical organisations around the country, and a leaving do for everyone else around the country was not acceptable under the guidelines or the rules. So why was it acceptable and necessary for work purposes in number 10?
Thank you, Sir Bernard. Well, I want to repeat what I said at the beginning. I understand that people looking at that photograph will think that it looks like a social event. It was not a social event. If anybody thinks that I was partying during lockdown, they're completely wrong. That was not a party. I was there to...
I haven't said it was a party, Mr. Johnson.
Well, you did actually earlier on. What I was doing was thanking staff, or thanking one individual in particular, for their contribution. And I believe that was my job.
Thanking someone for their contribution. Yeah, that's leaving drinks. We're talking about leaving drinks. Let's just talk about this whole point about leaving drinks. I literally cannot even believe we have to engage with this nonsense, and hopefully we don't have to engage with very much nonsense from Boris Johnson ever again, because literally no one in the country, no one thought leaving drinks were acceptable during lockdown. And I'm including Boris Johnson because even though he's pretending to be incredibly stupid, he actually isn't. This guy is taking the piss, many, many millions of gallons of piss. Now, when Bernard Jenkins asked him, if you were in a press conference and you were asked if it was okay for other people to have unsocially distanced farewell gatherings in workplaces, would you say it was okay? And he responded, no, I'd say follow the guidance. Well, obviously, because those unsocially distanced work gatherings, as he puts it, where people were getting drunk and drinking alcohol, clearly weren't acceptable, and he knows that. So obviously he wouldn't be able to tell the nation that, because it would have been ludicrous for him to do so. Now, he kept saying they were necessary to raise morale, but lots of occupations during lockdown could have done with morale raising. I don't know, like the National Health Service, for a start, given the nurses, doctors and other health staff carried us through the worst crisis since World War II. They could have done with morale boosting events of a similar description. The reason they didn't have them is because it was quite literally illegal to have them. That's because there was this government led by this guy called Boris Johnson who drew up legislation quite literally legally prohibiting them from doing so. And indeed, they were charged, Boris Johnson, very specifically with communicating those rules. Now, let's just put this in context, because what Boris Johnson is trying to have us believe is that it was illegal to be with dying relatives in their final moments. It was illegal to attend funerals for most people of their dead loved ones. If we talk just about some of those punishments dealt out, it was illegal for a pub landlord to have customers jumping up to celebrate a goal. He was fined £1,000 for that, because the rules were there were groups of 6, but they all had to be sitting. So as soon as they leapt up to celebrate a goal, the regulations were banned. The legislation came into effect and banned them from doing so. So the landlord was fined £1,000. It was against the law for a man to pick up his girlfriend to walk a dog. He was fined. It was illegal to organise a snowball fight. That Leeds student was fined £10,000. And let's be honest, outdoor gatherings, don't really think people are going to catch COVID realistically, unlike having parties in number 10. A beggar was fined £434 for having his cap out outside King's Cross. Other homeless people were also fined and charged during the pandemic. A Devon landlord held a Christmas gathering for their workers on the same day as the Downing Street Christmas party and got slapped with a £4,000 fine. So it was illegal for all of those things. Illegal for a snowball fight, illegal to stand up and celebrate a goal when it was legal actually to have indoor gatherings at the time, as long as you were sitting down. But it was legal to have boozy leaving drinks for colleagues. That doesn't make any sense, does it? I know it doesn't make any sense. You know it doesn't make any sense. And more to the point, Boris Johnson knows it doesn't make any sense. The excuses he came up with are ludicrous. I mean, when he was asked about the lack of mitigations during these boozy gatherings to stop the spread of COVID, he said, well, they weren't touching each other's pens in number 10. Well, they were handing each other drinks, glasses to each other, weren't they? So, but at least they weren't touching each other's pens. I mean, when Boris Johnson's former comms director, Lee Kane, declared he warned against holding a Downing Street garden party during lockdown on the grounds it was purely a social event, he was ignored. And Johnson said he didn't know why Kane warned against it, but acknowledged it might have been because he was concerned about the impression that we were doing something that other people weren't allowed to do. No shit, Sherlock. Hey, we're making some progress. Now, Boris Johnson has declared Dominic Cummings has every motive to lie about Partygate, but I think that kind of applies to you, doesn't it, Mr. Johnson? Now, he was asked why he didn't take proper advice from experts, and because he only spoke to, according to his own testimony, 2 spin doctors whose job it was to manage the media. They were obviously not equipped to make that judgment, so Johnson clearly hopes he can get away with only recklessly misleading the House rather than setting out to deceive, because he says that that the rules weren't broken by two people who, frankly, had about as much, of an expertise as he did. I mean, might as well just ask anyone, because if he was going to ask anyone, he would ask lawyers and experts. But apparently, he did not do so, even though he's the Prime Minister of the country. Could pretty much ask anyone, couldn't he? That's how it kind of works. He was asked, he couldn't answer why he could possibly have looked at these boozy gatherings and concluded they were above board. So, the only defence he's relying on is he's terminally stupid. He's completely, fatally thick. He's just an incredibly idiotic individual. He can barely, manage to get by in the world. Doesn't understand what's happening any of the time. Completely and utterly oblivious to the world around him. Chronically, terminally thick. That's his defence. I mean, it literally is the only possible defence that he can muster based on the arguments that he's proffered. But he isn't a stupid man. That's the thing. He's not a stupid man. He's a man who is absolutely riddled with entitlement. He's a man who doesn't think that rules apply to him, but they do apply to other people. That is Boris Johnson. He's a man who is defined by total selfishness, by self-advancement. Just someone who is in it purely for himself. I think even his most passionate supporters would concede a lot of what I just said about Boris Johnson. This is a venal, a self-centered, arrogant man whose only concern, essentially, is his own personal interests. He thinks that the law and rules are for the little guy and not for him. But that really, I have to say, and this is not letting Boris Johnson off the hook, applies in so many ways to the whole British establishment. In so many ways, Boris Johnson is the perfect personification of a British elite, which frankly gets away with it over and over again. Boris Johnson, you see, himself, and this is very important, all these people washing their hands of him. But who put him in power and who kept him there? It was most of our newspapers. It was the Conservative Parliamentary Party and the Conservative Party who knew he was unfit to be Prime Minister. But they put him there, didn't they? Because they felt at that particular moment he was best suited to serve their political ends. He was put in power and defended in power by so much of the British establishment, including, I have to say, some figures within the Labour Party who clearly preferred, in the end of the day, a Tory victory to that by a Labour Party led by their mortal enemy as they saw it. This man sums up a British establishment which is full of people who avoid taxes on an industrial scale, whilst poor people have their benefits stopped. Full of people, including the political elite, who take drugs, whilst young black men have their lives turned upside down, criminalised for having some weed or coke on them. A British establishment who's, where you got bankers who plunged the country into economic catastrophe and then got away with it and carried on making vast sums of money whilst millions of people were expected to pick up the price. It's 20 years on since the Iraq War, when, yes, another Prime Minister misled the House and misled the country and got away with it over something far graver, I have to say, than getting pissed in number 10. But as these people, over and over again, these powerful people, they know they can get away with anything, can't they? Because they do, over and over again. So is Boris Johnson all that different? He's vulgar, don't get me wrong. He's not actually very good, if you like, at covering up his own misdemeanours. But in so many ways, Boris Johnson is the perfect representation of a shameless, greedy, deceitful elite, which does honestly believe that the law and the rules don't apply to them, they apply to the little guy. And in that belief, in lots of ways, in modern Britain, they have a point. Please like, subscribe, and do support us on patreon.com/ownjones84. I'll see you soon.